Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of Eyewitness. Today I'm joined by Matthew Kay and Jasper Kane, the directors of a documentary called Over the Wall. And it's a very interesting story and we're very thankful to them for joining us on the show. So guys, I'd like to begin by asking you, what exactly is this film about?
Well, this film ultimately is about the character's journey. A football team from SOAS University in London, they head out into the Middle East, initially Egypt, and then go on to Palestine and Jordan. And it's a story about their characters and how they evolve and how they become changed and moved by the events they witness over there during the climate of change.
So, I mean, how did you guys stumble onto this story? Because it sounds like a very interesting story and a very intriguing one that perhaps brings together a university that's not really known for its sporting endeavors and a group of people who are not immediately associated with football. So just tell us a little bit more about how your association with the film came about.
I'd been part of the team for 3 years as a student at SOAS, and a group of us had set up a project called Football Beyond Borders, which tried to use the universal power of football to engage with local communities and break down common cultural boundaries that exist. And this was the third trip that we were going to do, and the captain, Joseph Watfa, he wanted to take the team to the Middle East, particularly at this time, and to try and go to Palestine. And at that time I said, I think this really needs to be documented. So I got in contact with Matthew, who had studied film at Queen Mary University, and then we set about documenting it. What we witnessed, we would never have imagined quite what we'd have seen. And once we got back 5 months ago, we really felt that the story needed to be told and documented to the widest possible audience.
So just when you said you were obviously part of the student team and you had an idea of what the dynamics were. When you were embarking on this journey, I mean, what sort of do you have any apprehensions? What did you think would be what sort of outcomes you might have? Were you worried about your safety?
Yeah, there's certainly internal and external considerations. So internally within the team, it's very diverse and it's a very unique team. But living side by side, playing football matches, having to get along for a month is always a consideration. And secondly, external considerations were huge. I mean, in two ways. Partly just going there. Just before we left, there was a bombing campaign that was launched on Gaza, and that continued as the trip went on, and thus there were certainly concerns about the safety of the players. There were also reports about tourists being taken hostage in the Sinai Desert, which the team were due to cross and eventually did cross. And then added into all of this is having a camera and some of the responsibility that comes with that, but also when you get a camera and you start filming, that can very much shape the dynamic. So for instance, filming in Tahrir Square with thousands of protesters on the street and a military that were very vigilant and wary about a certain message getting out certainly contributed towards a very interesting context to be filming and to be there. Added to that was the fact that we were carrying the tapes and we had to try and get the tapes back home, out of Egypt, into Israel. These considerations were particularly challenging, and added to all this, it was our first feature film, so it was certainly a pretty significant experience for both of us, I think.
Tell me a little bit more about the composition of your team. I mean, were they all Muslims? Were they all Arabs? But when the team was being composed, were there considerations that, okay, we need to have someone on board, or maybe we shouldn't take someone with us? Like, how did that go?
No, I mean, the philosophy of Football Beyond Borders is very much replicated within the team. For me, it's a representation of 21st century London. Very multicultural. We have people from all different backgrounds, different faiths. There were several Muslims in the team, Catholics, the Christians, real range of individuals. People from South America, people who originally come from Africa, but all people that found themselves studying in London And this is crucial for us because football is a game that can unify people, we believe. And even within the team, like I say, there's some internal differences. Perhaps we wouldn't be friends if it wasn't for the love of the game. So we very much travel in that spirit. So, I mean, the film really explores these different characters. It has 5 main characters, probably. 2 of the characters are British Lebanese. One, his parents originally come from Jamaica and Poland. Another, his parents come from Uganda. And the final one is from South America, from Uruguay. So a real range. And it's crucial to us that this is documented. And, there's a lot of stereotypes about what Britain is or should be. And this is really a celebration of diverse communities and identities, and a celebration of young people taking a stand and trying to do something positive.
Matthew, how did you get involved in this project? I understand that you, as Jasper mentioned, had studied film and therefore obviously had the expertise into it. But coming into this project, how did you find out about it? What was your initial reaction to it?
Well, as Jasper originally contacted me about it, telling me I was familiar with certain members of the team and knew about Football Beyond Borders, so it was a huge opportunity, and I was very excited about having this opportunity to go, especially with the diverse range of characters and their personalities, not only their appearance or their nationality, also their interests and religions. So I thought it'd be an amazing opportunity to get to film these people from one perspective, which is generally a British perspective, going out into the Middle East, where some of them have families, some of them have connections, others have studied the region. So I thought it'd make for a really interesting dynamic for the documentary. And I had some expertise, but that was mainly, I feel, was fiction based. And with this being a documentary is a whole different ball game, so to speak. It was being there, we just would be going to, say, the pyramids for a day, and the whole huge debate would just explode about should we go to Gaza or not. So then me and Jasper had to be at the ready with the cameras, and at every opportunity just be ready to film, which is a very different dynamic from the planned fiction.
Did you have any sort of experience with such politics beforehand? I mean, on a personal level or in terms of the work that you've done?
No, not in terms of work that I've done. It's been mainly character studies that I've done, so it's been more specific and more channeled. I felt that this was a great opportunity, and I was very interested in not only the region but in politics in general. And previous films have concentrated on marginalised members of society and people that often don't have a huge representation within our normal society. And I feel that this has similar links and trends in terms of the misrepresentation often of the region and often of students as well. So we try to explore not only to give justice to the representation of Arabs in the Middle East, what we had an amazingly positive and welcoming experience, and everyone was hugely affected by that, but also representations of students and of, say, first and second generation immigrants and living in London at the time.
You obviously had to organise the funds for this. You had to get, I would imagine, visas and all sorts of bureaucratic hassles to deal with. So once you decided, okay, let's go and document this, how did things proceed from there?
So, I mean, initially we didn't know exactly what to expect, as I said, so we didn't want to push the boat out too far. So we both spoke to our universities, Matthew to Queen Mary, myself to SOAS, and we managed to get very low budget cameras. We took out a couple of mics, and like I say, we just went out there trying to capture whatever we could. In terms of visas, the Egyptian leg, we flew into Hurghada, which is a seaside resort where many British tourists go every year. So that wasn't particularly difficult. We had a letter from the American University of Cairo, which allowed us to get the cameras in, but that it was told that we would only be filming in certain areas. So, and then it was a real challenge getting the cameras into Israel. And I won't say, I mean, the film really explores this actually, because we couldn't disclose everything about what we were going on to film. So it was a constant challenge, constant headache. then we filmed on mini DV tapes, so we had to try and get the footage out. We couldn't just digitalise it. We couldn't just put it straight onto a computer. We had 110 hours of footage. So there were constant considerations, constant headaches. We left much of the footage in Egypt with a friend who then flew back to London directly. So then we left it behind, and we just had to hope for the best. So it wasn't an easy task, and I wouldn't say there was any specific blueprint, but we generally had confidence and conviction, and I think that held us in good stead.
So talk to me about the specific itinerary that you guys had, and did that change as you moved along? So where did you start from when you left London? Where were the matches being held, and were there any changes that you had to make at the last minute?
Well, we initially flew into Hurghada, and that was more of like a training camp sort of feel. So there was no matches. That was just concentrating on getting acclimatised for the team, and for me in particular, and Jasper was training as well. So it is for just capturing that whole dynamic and for training. Afterwards we went to Cairo, which was very intense for the team. There's lots of decisions that had to be made in terms of where the journey would go from there. It had originally been planned to go to Gaza, but things had been more up in the air, and decisions had to be made due to the bombing campaign on Gaza. And also people going into the West Bank, there was a certain philosophy that was going to be upheld, and it compromised certain aspects of people's character morally.
What do you mean by a certain philosophy going to the West Bank?
Well, in terms of going through Israel, the decision was made to get into the West Bank, to enter through Jerusalem, East Jerusalem,
right.
So across from West to East Jerusalem. And in order to get into Israel, we went to Eilat, and it all will be disclosed in the film, but just briefly, it wasn't thought wise to tell them that we were going to then aim to play in Palestine, which was our ultimate goal for the team and for the film. And so, because we weren't going to say this, we had to go under a guise and pretend that that wasn't our aim, to go into Palestine, and that compromised some people's moral obligations in terms of withholding the truth,
right.
Which is obviously very tricky. So that was hard for everyone. And so then we were in Cairo, and we made the journey into Israel, and then up through Israel, which we didn't stay in. Then we went to Palestine, where there's other football matches before ending in Jordan.
Okay. So who was making the sort of, obviously I'd imagine the team is trying to make collective decisions, but was there at some point, especially as the filmmakers, that one of you felt you had to take a leadership role or sort of step in and say, well, all right then, I've heard everyone, this is how we're going to go about it?
We tried to remain fairly hands-off, particularly I was a team member myself, and I'd been captain a couple of years ago, so I was conscious I didn't want to be too imposing. And there's a culture that exists in the football team, which is very democratic. Yeah. It's believed that you must debate points through, and then if it comes down to it, then a vote should be held. And Joseph, the captain, was very keen to try and do that. He certainly had his own, he'd kind of planned the trip back here in London when it was peaceful and calm. And then obviously, as Matthew's just said, we had to adapt and we had to reassess constantly because of the changing circumstances. As filmmakers, we were very keen that the trip followed its itinerary. We were very keen that the team went to Gaza. We were very keen that the team went to the West Bank. And there were moments when particularly I felt an urge to speak out, but I tried to do that more as a team member than as a filmmaker. What we did do a lot of is have many interviews, individual interviews, once most of the team had gone to bed, when it was nice and quiet in the accommodation we were staying in, where we would pull certain individuals aside who were maybe contemplating things, or you could see already that it was affecting their decision-making process. And we would pull them in and just have a conversation and try and tease out some of the considerations that were going through their minds. And I think that probably did get them to reflect maybe a little bit more, at least articulate and crystallise in their minds a little bit more of exactly what they wanted to do. And there was an overarching sense of the team that they'd come so far and that they should follow through with things. So whilst Gaza, there was a huge couple of debates that happened around whether the team should go to Gaza, but eventually there was the tunnels around the Rafah crossing were being targeted actually by the Egyptians, and as a result it made it now impossible to travel through the Rafah crossing, and the decision was made by the team, which neither Matthew or I contributed towards, not to go. But then there was a general consensus in the team. I'd say, I mean, there was many different voices, and the documentary explores this, but there was a consensus that, if possible, the team should really try and complete the rest of their itinerary. And we were very keen, like I say, to ensure that we could try and be as venturous as possible and carry through with the stated aims and the philosophy of the tour. So I'd say we were active. You know, I study anthropology, and we call it participant observation. Right. So we observed, but we also participated.
So Matthew, you were obviously, in a sense, you knew Jasper and everything, and you were a filmmaker as well, but you were also an outsider of sorts, you know, and so you weren't part of the playing team, and yet as the filmmaker you had to make sure that you were involved in all, making sure that you're capturing all these decisions. In that sense, I mean, did you have a sense of frustration, or your sense of a feeling that this whole thing might just come unstuck anytime?
There wasn't a sense of frustration, because even when these decisions were being made, they're very diplomatic and democratic, in a sense, where it was collective and people voted and said their opinions. And Joe, the captain, he actually said that with this tour his aim was to create the perfect society, and he wanted to have a peaceful, as in a sense that everyone would then be able to vocalise their opinions. So that whole process was fascinating to watch and to document. So I wouldn't say it's frustrating. It maybe would have been frustrating that certain things couldn't happen, but I'd say just documenting and having, I guess, the camera as a barrier, or as something in between, a divider between me and the team, was sometimes helpful, in the sense that I was slightly detached from the situation, but yeah, we still had a very close connection with the players. And the initial interviews we actually did before the team went out and embarked on this incredible journey, it was a very intense experience, because we were in this interview room and the players came in one by one, and I hadn't met the vast majority of them, and I found out certain things without ever speaking to them that I probably wouldn't know from knowing them for a year or 2 years. So I think that experience of getting to know them in a very quick circumstance helped to form a bond with not only me but with the whole team, I guess including me as a collective, which then developed as we went on, and we experienced and shared events together.
This was obviously not just, I mean, a trip of multicultural British students traveling to the Middle East, to Palestine in particular, to play a football game, has a whole bunch of political connotations as it is. But you guys were traveling during the Arab Spring, which, you know, is one of the events of the century, so to speak. So, I mean, from the outset, individually, each one of you, what sort of political stance did you have on what was going on? Like, you know, what was your opinion while you were still here in London about what was going on, firstly in Palestine, and secondly with the Arab Spring at large?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to distinguish sometimes the Arab Spring from the Palestinian issue, because I think they have slightly different histories and slightly different trajectories. Well, there are certain offshoots of colonialism that shape how the region has played itself out. I think, given that Palestine still doesn't have a formally recognised state in an international arena, you know, it's slightly different than, say, and I think as a result, what we experienced, particularly in the West Bank, wasn't exactly the same as what we experienced in Egypt. But before I went out, to answer your question, I guess like a lot of people, I mean, I was very excited. It's hard not to, when you see that many people standing, defying, you know, guns and just saying, you know, we've had enough. We stand up for what we believe in. But a revolution, you know, you read about these things from different periods throughout history, but it's rare to actually see it. And I think that was a really powerful experience. Last year I was president of the Students' Union at SOAS, and there were a lot of Arab students that wanted to be represented. So it was fascinating to be in that position and see how this kind of domino effect occurred. You know, first Tunisians and then Egyptians and people from Bahrain and Libya, and it was certainly there was a. But at the same time, I was aware that as it got closer to the trip, and this is something that very much played itself out in while we were there, that maybe this symbolic change had occurred and people had risen up, but maybe that process of change hadn't been completed, and you started to see this play itself out during the summer and as it ran up to the trip. So I went with anticipation, but an awareness that maybe it wasn't going to be as simple as just going and saying, oh, look how much everything's changed. Often when you've had an old regime that's been in power for so long, that power is entrenched, particularly if it's in bed with a security apparatus. And I was aware of that. As much as I reject what happened in Iraq with the invasion by the Allied forces, you saw there when you just take away a leadership, it can kind of dismantle a whole sort of apparatus that shakes things up. And so that, in terms of Egypt, in terms of the Palestinian question, yeah, it was an issue that was certainly close to my heart, but I've visited Tibet, I've been to the Kurdish region, Turkey, and so I've been to many places where people, Sri Lanka with Tamils, where people don't have their own state and they want self-determination. And I wouldn't necessarily say Palestine, it didn't necessarily have more significance than any of those others, and that's since perhaps changed. But I was very conscious that what existed there was unfair, but I felt that so often the region is depicted through two narratives. On the one hand, sort of conflict and bloodshed and arms and a very negative portrayal around that, which is infused with this notion of religious fanaticism. Then these other characteristics about Arabs in general, more kind of anthropological things to do with them, like being chauvinistic or lazy or these kind of character portrayals. And so I just felt that, and the rest of the team did, that football was a wonderful medium to try and go and challenge these ideas. And I'd like to think we went out with a fairly open mind. And what we witnessed when we were there, it certainly provided a lot of answers, but many more questions. I think in Egypt we experienced a country that was undergoing a lot of change, but there was a certain tension in the air, and people clearly weren't happy. And we spent some time as well with some of the wealthier universities in Cairo, and they seemed to be a little bit resistant to what was going on. And you could still feel there was an underlying security apparatus that was trying to realign its power. And so I left Cairo, in one hand I was kind of inspired, but I also did feel that there was unfinished business and that it was very much being contested. And I think that since we've left in the last 5 months, that's continued to play itself out. Yeah, in terms of Israel and Palestine, I think I had a basic idea, and my broader politics maybe made me sympathise with the Palestinians, but I had no idea exactly what it was like on the ground. I had no idea about some of the basic human rights that were denied to the local people. And so for me that really changed. Instead of the issue just being about being, say, pro-Palestinian, it was actually about being more pro-human rights. And just, I think that really, it triggered a real desire for us to document this to people, and not to necessarily take the most overtly political stance in the documentary, certainly from the offset and in general, but more just trying to lay out some of the, and trying to get people to empathise with some of the situation on the ground, which I think can touch basic instincts within people. You know, the ability to be free and not fear in your own home, to be able to travel freely, to have equal access to resources, something that's, I mean, doesn't happen a lot around the world, but still to have the right to travel and to have an education system, not to be intimidated. I mean, certain things maybe that, while it's not perfect here, there's some things we take for granted, just hopping on the tube to come up here, which are denied to the Palestinians. And what really, really struck me, I mean, I've been to many Arab states now. I've been to 6 altogether. But there was something actually very special about the people within the West Bank. And what we witnessed weren't kind of very... they were quite... they were very accepting people, but very determined that they would ultimately get their way, and they were very warm and welcoming towards us. And, you know, we had British players like myself, we had Americans in the team, but they have very much open-armed to us, and they're so hospitable. And it really broke down any remaining stereotypes I may have had. And it also made me realise that one should be careful about stereotyping the region. I've been to Saudi Arabia, I've been to Egypt, I've been to Syria, I've been to Lebanon, I've been to Turkey, and each country, while it has similar traits, you know, Muslims following faith in the main, there's certain differences about how those communities play themselves out, and I think it's very careful, and I think a Western audience needs to continually be educated about that, and that was something I was very conscious about. And lastly, I would just say that we didn't spend a great deal of time in Israel, and that wasn't the aim of the trip. Wasn't to, you know, football beyond borders. It was to break down certain boundaries that exist for the Palestinians, and we were intending to go in and interact and engage. But it was what I will say was that it was slightly frightening, the militarized nature of society, and you've got young people that are growing up into a climate of heavy securitization, and I think psychologically that must have a huge effect. And you can't necessarily say a 17-year-old has much choice about whether to join the army or not. I know if there was conscription here, and I grew up in the countryside in England, and someone said to me, right, you've got to go and fight for your country. Now I think I know what my answer would be, but I think it's quite difficult to ask that. And so, I mean, actually, in a broader sense of it, it's slightly frightening that this exists, and greater work needs to be done into exploring how this shapes the society, and, you know, if we're going to live in a peaceful and sustainable world, which I think we all want. And wary about a certain message getting out certainly contributed towards a very interesting context to be filming and to be there. Added to that was the fact that we were carrying the tapes, and we had to try and get the tapes back home, out of Egypt, into Israel. These considerations were particularly challenging, and added to all this, it was our first feature film, so it was certainly a pretty significant experience for both of us, I think.
Tell me a little bit more about the composition of your team. I mean, were they all Muslims? Were they all Arabs? You know, and but when the team was being composed, were there considerations that, okay, we need to have someone on board, or maybe we shouldn't take someone with us? Like, how did that go?
No, I mean, the philosophy of football beyond.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of Eyewitness. Today I'm joined by Matthew Kay and Jasper Kane, the directors of a documentary called Over the Wall. And it's a very interesting story, and we're very thankful to them for joining us on the show. So guys, I'd like to begin by asking you, what exactly is this film about?
Well, this film ultimately is about the character's journey. A football team from SOAS University in London, they head out into the Middle East, initially Egypt, and then go on to Palestine and Jordan, and it's a story about their characters and how they evolve and how they become changed and moved by the events they witness over there during the climate of change.
So, I mean, how did you guys stumble onto this story? Because it sounds like a very interesting story, and a very intriguing one that perhaps brings together a university that's not really known for its sporting endeavors and a group of people who are not immediately associated with football. So just tell us a little bit more about how your association with the film came about.
I'd been part of the team for 3 years as a student at SOAS, and a group of us had set up a project called Football Beyond Borders, which tried to use the universal power of football to engage with local communities and break down common cultural boundaries that exist. And this was the third trip that we were going to do, and the captain, Joseph Watfa, he wanted to take the team to the Middle East, particularly at this time, and to try and go to Palestine. And side by side playing football matches, having to get along for a month is always a consideration. And secondly, external considerations were huge. I mean, in two ways. Partly just going there. Just before we left, there was a bombing campaign that was launched on Gaza, and that continued as the trip went on, and thus there were certainly concerns about the safety of the players. There were also reports about tourists being taken hostage in the Sinai Desert, which the team were due to cross and eventually did cross. And then added into all of this is having a camera and some of the responsibility that comes with that, but also when you get a camera and you start filming, that can very much shape the dynamic. So for instance, filming in Tahrir Square with thousands of protesters on the street and a military that were very vigilant. At that time I said, I think this really needs to be documented. So I got in contact with Matthew, who had studied film at Queen Mary University, and then we set about documenting it. What we witnessed, we would never have imagined quite what we'd have seen, and once we got back 5 months ago, we really felt that the story needed to be told and documented to the widest possible audience.
So just when you said you were obviously part of the student team, and you had an idea of what the dynamics were. When you were embarking on this journey, I mean, what sort of did you have any apprehensions? What did you think would be what sort of outcomes you might have? Were you worried about your safety?
Yeah, there's certainly internal and external considerations. So internally within the team, it's very diverse, and it's a very unique team, but living